Hello, botanists. Welcome back. So today we're going to be beginning one of my absolute favorite groups, and that's really Kingdom Plantae. And so our plan for today is to talk about what defines a plant as far as those characteristics go. All right, so thinking about the course, we've already met fungi, we've already met algae, we've talked a little bit about bacteria. Now we're entering a new group, and eventually we'll kind of look at where all this fits in as far as thinking about a cladogram and the tree of life and all that. But we are entering a new kingdom, right? This Kingdom Plantae, commonly known as plants, organisms that I know you're familiar with just because they're our food, they're what we build our homes out of, they surround us all the time. Now this group is going to include 4 different groups. And in lab in the coming months, we're going to meet all these groups, both in the lab and also in the field, to see them out there. They include the bryophytes. These are plants like mosses. They include seed-free vascular plants. And seed-free vascular plants are plants like ferns, which I know you have at least some idea of being Humboldt County people. Plants also include gymnosperms, which are things like conifers, redwood trees. And finally, the final group of plants are going to be the angiosperms, or flowering plants. And in these coming weeks, if I just share a different screen. In these coming weeks, we're going to be meeting plants and meeting these different groups and talking about what defines them. We're going to be talking about how they evolved and changed from each other, and eventually creating something like this, which is just a cladogram or phylogenetic tree showing how plants evolved and changed from each other. Well, before we get into this, I want to talk about what defines a plant to kind of make this parallel with how we covered some of these other groups. And by that, I mean fungi, I mean our protists, right, that we met before winter break. So let's think about these characteristics, right, and how we would compare plants to other forms of life. So one of the characteristics of plants that they share with fungi, that they share with protists, and that they share with us as animals is that they're going to be eukaryotic. Remember, most of the forms of life that we've seen are going to have eukaryotic cells. The one exception to that are the blue-green algae, or cyanobacteria. This just means that their cells are going to be larger, have nuclei, and other membrane-bound organelles. Well, plants, unlike ourselves as animals, are going to be autotrophs. So one of those membrane-bound organelles that we can find inside their cytoplasm are going to be chloroplast. Plants are going to be autotrophs with chloroplast. Remember, with anything photosynthetic, we kept track of those pigments because the color of the pigments changes the color of the chloroplast, changes the color of the whole organism. And it's a way that we told different algae apart. As far as what plants have, they're going to have green chloroplast, kind of this grass green color, from the pigments chlorophyll A and the carotenoids. So chlorophyll A and the carotenoids are going to be their primary photosynthetic pigments. These are going to be the same as green algae. Green algae are really the ancestors of plants. And so many of their characteristics are really going to be tied to this green algae, right? Green algae are eukaryotic. They're going to be autotrophs with chloroplasts, and those chloroplasts are going to be green in color from chlorophyll and the carotenoids. Another feature that plants share with green algae is that they're going to have cell walls made out of cellulose. Remember, animals aren't going to have cell walls. Fungi are going to have cell walls made out of chitin, and algae in general are going to have various components in their cell walls. Another characteristic that plants are going to share with green algae is that they're going to store their excess carbohydrates in the form of starch. And if you can think back to the first lab where we looked at microscopes, you looked at those potato cells, and you saw all those little starch grains inside the cells. You saw that storage really easily in potato cells. All right, well, something that's different from the ancestors of plants, from green algae to plants, is that almost all plants are terrestrial. Now, there are a few weirdo plants that have moved back to the water, like Elodea, that plant that we saw when we were looking at plant cells and that we also included in our ecosystems in a jar. But the vast, vast majority of all plants are terrestrial, right? Their ancestors were not, right? They were green algae that are primarily aquatic. Well, a terrestrial life is going to be a lot more environmentally stressful. You've got much more intense sunlight. You've got the stress of wind. You've got more intense gravity. You also have to deal with drying up, things that aren't as intense if you're living a life aquatic, right? If you're living in the water. And what that means is that all plants, unlike their ancestors, are going to be complex multicellular creatures. And earlier in the course, when we looked at the anatomy of roots and stems and leaves and talked about how plants grew, you saw how complex plants could be, from both the morphological perspective and also the anatomical perspective when we looked under the microscope. All of that complex multicellularity is really due to dealing with life on land, due to dealing with the separation from where photosynthesis occurs, up above ground, and separation from where absorption occurs, say getting water from the soil. As we go through our different plant groups, the bryophytes, seed vascular plants, gymnosperms, and angiosperms, we'll see how the plant body has adapted and changed through evolutionary history. This last general characteristic that I want to give you for kingdom Plantae is the life cycle that plants share. And it's something that we call an alternations of generations life cycle. Now, this is going to be really different compared to our own animal life cycles. If we think about ourselves, right, the multicellular part of our bodies is going to be diploid. Inside our bodies, right, in either the ovaries or the testicles, those cells are going to go through meiosis and to produce gametes or sex cells. That's going to reduce ploidy and generate some genetic diversity. Those gametes or sex cells are haploid. They have to fuse. They have to come together to form a zygote. That zygote can then grow into another multicellular creature like myself, like you. Well, plants are going to be a little bit different because they actually have two multicellular generations. Now, this is really different than us, right? The only multicellular part of our life cycle is going to be diploid. The haploid part of our life cycle, that's our gametes, our sex cells, our eggs or sperm, those are going to be very short-lived. They have to fuse. They have to come together. Well, depending upon the plant, these generations can be free-living, not attached to each other. But they're always going to be multicellular, which is kind of weird. I want to give you the names for these two multicellular generations, although we're going to see them in more depth in these coming weeks. The first of these multicellular generations is going to be a little more similar to us, and we call it the sporophyte. So this is the diploid multicellular generation. Remember, diploid, we abbreviate 2N. So the sporophyte is the diploid multicellular generation. Thinking of word roots, because I know they really help me. Phyte means plant, and spore means spore producing. So what's going to happen is ultimately, in an alternation of generations life cycle, the sporophyte is eventually going to produce spores through meiosis. The spores are going to be haploids. I'm just going to put that right there. Because you know that the products of meiosis are going to be haploid, right? They produce spores by meiosis. Those haploid spores grow into this other generation that we call the gametophyte. The gametophyte is the other multicellular generation. So gametophytes are always going to be haploid, meaning they've got one set of chromosomes in each one of their cells. So we abbreviate that just N. Right? This is the haploid multicellular generation in plant life cycles. And if we think about word roots again, phyte here still means plant. Gameto means gamete producing or sex cell producing. And so ultimately, gametophytes are going to produce gametes, eggs or sperm. Plants actually have eggs and sperm just like we do. They're going to produce those gametes or eggs or sperm by mitosis. So plants are different from us because they've got these two distinct multicellular generations with different ploidies, right? One diploid, one haploid, and they're also going to produce gametes or sex cells by mitosis. In our own human life cycles, we're always going to produce gametes or sex cells by meiosis. And so it's going to be a little bit hard for us to relate to just because it's a very, very different way of being. Now, as we go through these different plant groups, the bryophytes, seed-free vascular plants, gymnosperms, and angiosperms, we'll be talking about what those sporophytes and gametophytes look like. All right, well, I will leave it here for today. See you soon.